Every time I say I want the MT en 180 secondes, people start speaking in French. I'm like, maybe. My first introduction to earth sciences was in my bachelor's, which was in petroleum studies.
You knew nothing about geology?
Nothing.
Yeah.
I didn't know like what kind of rocks were.
Even granites?
Nothing.
Actually, you speak French.
Oui, un peu, mais je préfère anglais parce que oui, je me débrouille normalement, mais yeah.
Alright, that's pretty good.
I was trying to study Syria. To go to Syria in 2022 wasn't such a good idea.
Yeah.
It was still a conflict zone. Also, we tried getting partners on the ground, but it wasn't always about the security. Sometimes it was about the politics. I remember that it was the first time I leave my country.
How was it?
In the PhD, you have very few moments like that.
Yeah.
And it's usually just trying things, failures, trying this method, trying that. But at some point, I believe that it's those moments that keeps me motivated to do a postdoc.
Yeah.
On Facebook, what happened is that after my second paper was out, it got viral. And it was viral through Arabiya. There's conflicts around the world, but it's nowhere close to the scale of mining. And I really appreciate your podcast because in that way, people can get to know better geology, science, and what we do, and they can know it through stories. Mm-hmm. And the power of stories and narratives is, I would say, underappreciated in science. Hello, I'm Saeed Mhanna. I'm a hydrogeologist, and we are on WE ROCK.
Salut et bienvenue dans ce format de WE ROCK. Nous recevons pour vous des spécialistes de notre planète pour découvrir leur parcours, leur quotidien et la vérité sur leur métier. Merci de regarder cette vidéo et merci surtout de nous soutenir en vous abonnant, en likant et en partageant cette vidéo. Cet épisode est disponible aussi en podcast audio sur toutes les plateformes d'écoute. Bonne vidéo. Welcome Saeed on WE ROCK.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm pretty happy to have you today.
Thanks.
And Saeed, you forgot to say that you are a doctor today.
Yeah, well, it's quite new, so I'm still getting used to it, yeah.
Saeed, we'll talk about your journey, your life journey, from your academic starting, the bachelor project until today, okay? We'll see through your life journey. You've passed through interesting things from Lebanon until today. You passed through UK, Switzerland.
Yeah.
Saeed, my traditional question in WE ROCK is this one: why earth sciences?
Yeah. So my first introduction to earth sciences was in my bachelor's, which was in petroleum studies. The thing about petroleum is that back in 2013, so that's when I graduated high school, there was all this hype about finding petroleum and exploration in Lebanon. And we always looked at our neighbors, so Iraq and the Gulf states, and we found that they had so much money and we're poor there and we need petroleum.
Yeah.
So it was all the hype. And that's why I decided like I have a go at this. And I kind of like the subject, but I didn't really know too much because our educational system didn't introduce us to anything in geology.
You knew nothing about geology?
Nothing.
Yeah.
I didn't know like what kind of rocks were.
Even granites?
Nothing.
Interesting.
So this is a real problem in our region. And then the first introduction was at the American University of Beirut, petroleum studies. I kind of got into the petroleum thing, but it didn't really click to me. I always felt like it was a bit lacking. And since I didn't have any practical experience, it was all theory. In the AUB, in the American University of Beirut, I always felt like I didn't have a real connection there with this topic. And then earth sciences, more specifically hydrogeology, was my first job, was like the real introduction to the real case the real world, if you want to say.
Yeah, and at that time you decided no longer wanting to be in the petroleum.
No, I mean then they took a while. There was some troubles, and then they drilled a well. It wasn't empty.
Yeah.
So I think
Disappointed.
if I made a bet, I would have been winning now, because I mean eventually nothing happened out of the. And I feel like also now there's a trend also to move away from petroleum. It's not just something that's practical, there's all the issues with carbon emissions and decarbonizing. And I feel like also back then, I was aware of these issues. So I'm very glad that currently I'm in the water sector in hydrogeology, and
And you've spent years in the field in Lebanon, rural communities.
Yes. So after my bachelor's, I spent 2 years working on projects related to securing water resources for refugees, basically Syrian refugees. So after the Syrian war, Lebanon had the highest refugee number per population, and it already stressed a stressed system. So there was a lot of demand on water resources, and management-wise, it was a bit of a messy situation.
What was the actually like day-to-day tasks?
So we did a lot of borehole drilling, pumping tests, river flow measurements, just trying to quantify how much water resources we had and try to secure more. So rehabilitation of springs, and making new systems to optimize the supply of water. So those were typical consultancy type of jobs in groundwater. Yeah.
How was it your first job to see that you are applying your sciences for the people?
So it was quite nice, and I remember that whenever we finished drilling a well, the people would make a celebration.
The joy.
And it was really such a touching moment. You can, because that you've changed their lives for the better. So that was something that I touched. And also I felt also there that how much impact the war through migration, through refugees, had impact on the water resources. So that I saw that the systems in Lebanon were really getting stressed, and there was a problem of management. How could we better manage the systems? Yeah.
And afterward, you have to leave your country.
Yeah, then I decided that I wanted to go more into the direction of hydrogeology. So I did a master in hydrogeology in the UK, in Birmingham. It was a short course, but very intense.
Yeah.
I remember that it was the first time I leave my country.
How was it?
It was a cultural shock, and I feel I remember that it took me a while to adjust to the weather and to the food, and moving from a Mediterranean country to the cloudy Midlands.
Yeah.
So that was quite an experience, yeah. But I learned a lot. I met some of the best people that in the field, basically, yeah.
And what was the topic on one you worked on?
So it was in two kind of dimensions. There was the field, the coursework. We did all sorts of introductory modeling courses, hydraulics, groundwater hydraulics, contaminant studies, how to drill a well.
Basics.
Yeah, the basics of hydrogeology. And then there was also a thesis where I decided that I wanted to go more into the direction of groundwater modeling. And that was an interesting, I mean, I really fell in love with the topic in my thesis.
Yeah, for someone who doesn't know anything about modeling groundwater, what can you tell about it?
Yeah, so with modeling, we try to represent reality, but through equation, through numerical models. And this helps us to try to understand what would happen if we adjust the systems. So if we try, for example, to drill a well, how much the groundwater is gonna reduce in volume. Or for example, if we want to treat a contaminant, how much water should we pump? What kind of system should we install? So it's trying to represent reality through numerical equations. It's not always easy, because there's a saying, all models are wrong, some models are useful. So try to stick to the usefulness of it.
They are useful.
They are useful, yeah, but also it's useful to a certain extent, and we have to be aware about the uncertainties that they come with.
And after your master, what have you done?
So then I went back to Lebanon, and I worked on seawater intrusion. So it was also a UNICEF-funded project where I focused on trying to understand how does saline water, so the water from the Mediterranean, is infiltrating towards the coastal aquifers. So when we pump in the coast, we were getting salt water. And that's not very healthy. It's affecting crops also. And the majority of the population in Lebanon is on the coast. So Beirut, Tripoli, Tyre. And we wanted to try to see how we can better understand these coastal aquifers. Yeah.
And at what time did you decide to go to Switzerland to do a PhD?
Yeah. So my decision came firstly because I was interested in the topic, but secondly also because we were having a lot of troubles in Lebanon economically. So I couldn't anymore afford living there. It was getting a bit tight. But really the topic was kind of like, I'm really interested in that. And if you want, we can talk about...
Before going into any details, what's the title, let's say, the global title of the topic?
Yeah, so the global title is trying to understand hydrological transformations in conflict zones. So how water changes in conflict.
Yeah. Okay. Before going into details again, you decided going to University de Neuchâtel, and you integrated the SHIN, right? The Center of Hydrogeology
and Geothermics. Exactly.
What is this center?
Yeah, so the SHIN is a renowned center department in the university here in Neuchâtel that they do studies on groundwater. So we have a lot of studies on modeling groundwater, geological modeling, contaminant transport, also geophysics. So everything that helps us to study groundwater. And there's a lot of methods, and it's been going on since, I don't know the exact year, but since many years. And how it was related to my topic is that my professor, Françoise Vallen, did a lot of work in Syria. And there was an opportunity for a project to carry on his work. So that's how I got integrated. So they also had the humanitarian perspective. They had some humanitarian jobs or work in Chad, in Syria, Botswana, Kazakhstan. So they had a lot of international exposure as well as Swiss.
How was your first days in Switzerland? Was it easy to integrate the society of scientifics?
Yeah. First, I remember first coming here, it was still COVID, like end of COVID. Yeah, it was, I went to university, there was no one. It feels like an eternity. But it was very lovely in terms of, like, I directly got in the atmosphere. And the nice thing about Neuchâtel is that it's a small university. So there's maybe 50 people in the institute. You directly blend in.
Yeah.
You don't need to feel like there's all these different departments. No, it's all of them eat in the same room.
Mm-hmm.
And we all got together. And I'm really, really grateful for the time I spent here. I love it.
Was it easy to make connections with other PhD students?
Yeah. Not only the international one, but also the local. I also had local friends from Neuchâtel, and I felt at home really. Mm-hmm. And I still visit. And today we're
actually you speak French.
Oui, un peu, mais je préfère anglais parce que oui, je me débrouille normalement, mais yeah.
All right, that's pretty good.
Yeah.
So you've worked on a project really interesting, and I can say today you've won the competition Ma Thèse en 180 secondes.
Exactly.
At the scale at the level of your university and as the scale of the whole country, Switzerland.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So now, before talking deeply into the project, we need to put some basics, okay?
Yeah.
Because you are an expert of your science, and our listeners maybe need to know basics about, let's say, remote sensing, INSAR, COSHO, stuff like that, okay? So you've worked on investigating how armed conflict reshape water systems through rapid land use change.
Yeah.
On how it can also disrupt hydrogeological processes.
Yeah.
And finally, the damage of major water structures. Sorry.
Exactly.
What is the remote sensing?
Yeah. So why I got into remote sensing from my field-based experience was because I was trying to study Syria. To go to Syria in 2022 wasn't such a good idea.
Yeah.
It was still a conflict zone. Also, we tried getting partners on the ground, but it wasn't always about the security. Sometimes it was about the politics. So they didn't have it was always politicized how it worked. So I was like, okay, there is no field access. Let's try about other ways, think about other ways how we can understand what's going on there. And here comes the remote sensing. So a remote sensing is using data obtained from satellites. So these are the satellites that orbit the Earth. And it was already a mature field when I got into it. And now it's even booming more. And if you've seen SpaceX, how much they got money, it's gonna get even more.
Yeah, this is the future.
This is the future, and it's gonna just explode. Hopefully not literally. So it was just a good moment for me to get into the remote sensing because I felt like there was a lot of potential, and it could help me understand what was going on in Syria without going to the field. So we use in remote sensing different types of sensors. So we have cameras. These are the optical ones. So these you can as taking images, and you use radar. So in radar you kind of send the wave. So you it's an active system. So you it's like having the microwave basically is a radar. Like they have electromagnetic waves. So a radar flies and then it emits electromagnetic waves and then measure its reflectance. So these are two main types of remote sensing. And also something else that was emerging was cloud-based platforms.
What is it?
So these are the platforms that are they work on the cloud. So you don't have to download any data. You can order the results to be processed in a computer somewhere in Google, because that's the company that pioneered this work, and they have Google Earth Engine.
Yeah.
So all the data lives in the cloud. They do the processing there. They do all the tough stuff, and then you can observe the results. So that was really a revolutionary moment, because you no longer need to download all the data, use very heavy computing to do the processing yourself. Now you can just focus on doing the interesting things rather than managing how to geoformat and all these complicated IT things.
Yeah. There is also the machine learning.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So machine learning also was it was already being used in remote sensing, but the concept behind it is that because we had so many images and we had so many different sources of data, it's hard to try to do it manually, to analyze the results manually. So when you train a machine to do your job, basically, for example, I say this pixel here is a cropland, this pixel is an urban area. Instead of doing all the pixels yourself, you can train the machine. This is how a cropland look. Find all the croplands. So that's basically what was. Also, it's a method to process data efficiently and give also consistent results and more
quickly.
Yeah.
It's kind of an artificial intelligence.
Yeah. So it's one of the artificial intelligence methods. Yeah.
And there is also the causal analysis.
Yeah. So causal analysis is another method that we use to try to understand causation and not correlation. So if you're trying to look at two variables, how they react with each other, sometimes, like if you look, for example, at ice cream sales and wearing shorts, they look correlated, but there is no causal analysis. Like there is no causal link. It's not that you eat ice cream because you're wearing shorts. It's because there is a third factor, which is temperature, which is influencing both. So instead of looking at correlation, we look at causation. So what is causing the thing to change? And this was very important in my case, because I wanted to try to understand what is causing the changes. Is it climate or is it conflict? So there was, inherently, it was a causal question.
Yeah.
In my case.
Yeah. And you've worked on a project, the Kakhovka Dam.
Yeah.
And one night, 20 cubic kilometer of water ran away.
Yeah.
In one night.
Yeah. So that was the large dam that was constructed on the Dnipro River in southern Ukraine, and it got bombed, and that led to the reservoir to drain. And the scale of the reservoir is massive. It's almost 1.5 times Lake Neuchâtel. So imagine such a huge volume of water just draining. The first question I asked myself was, what's that causing to change in the hydrology? So we looked at this event using gravity.
Yeah.
So to explain how that works, remember that gravity is associated with mass. The higher the mass, the higher the gravity. It happens that we have a satellite, or two satellites, that are called GRACE. And GRACE, you have to imagine that there are two satellites that fly next to each other. And whenever there's a big mass, they kind of go down because they are attracted more to that mass. And they are like Tom and Jerry. So when Jerry goes down, Tom goes down, and then they move. And then by measuring the distance between Tom and Jerry and the elevation from the ground, we can infer the gravity. And we measure this gravity monthly, and we were able to see that gravity was reducing. Why? Because water was draining to the sea. So it was no longer being kept inland. It was just going
directly to the sea.
To the sea. And this really aggravated over the years. Now, that was one part that we studied. And then we studied two other. If you want, we can go through them now.
We can go through the second one.
Yeah. So the other thing was that in conflict, what happens is that because there is so much changes, sometimes people want to make sense of these changes, or like try to also link to the slightest hope. So when the reservoir drained, there was a new ecosystem emerging. So instead of the reservoir, when it drained, there was wetlands. So these wetlands, they were there before the reservoir was constructed. So people were looking at this new ecosystem and they were thinking, there's a new thing there. We have to try to save it. We have to try to do something about it. And it reminded them about the pre-Soviet times. So it was nostalgia and it was a conflict zone. So it was just coming together to create this narrative that we need to protect the wetlands. So the wetlands, it's a very tricky ecosystem because it's very delicate. And I try to look at the vegetation, how it's growing, but there's a few risks involved with that. First, as I said before, there is less water. So will the water available now be sufficient to maintain a wetland ecosystem? Or does it look like the 1950s? I doubt. The second thing was invasive species, because when you have a new kind of it's like
it's a new environment.
white paper, and you're trying to something else is emerging.
Yeah.
So whenever you have an invasive species, these can really take over. So you lose biodiversity. The third thing was also there was all these toxic sediments in the ground. What do we think about Ukraine and about toxic things?
Yeah.
It's the Chernobyl. So all these nasty stuff from Chernobyl came and deposited in the lake bed. Add to that this is a huge river, so there was a higher risk of flooding. So without the dam, you would have flooding in downstream. And historically, there were some very big floods. So also this is something that people were afraid about. But this is from the point of ecology and reservoir. But also, the dam was useful. It was used for irrigation, for hydropower, for drinking water. They treat the water, even for cooling the nuclear power plants. So it was a dilemma. Do we build the dam
back,
or do we preserve the wetlands? So it's these questions that in conflict and in post-conflict especially that were really interesting to me. And I hope that I can provide the information needed by the stakeholders to make an informed decision.
Yeah. And what about Syria?
Yeah, so Syria is a different topic. It's closer to home, and it's also based on the work that was done in Neuchâtel. The issue with Syria is based on the Orontes River basin. So that's a basin that starts in Lebanon, it goes to Syria, and then it ends in the Mediterranean in Turkey. And it's been heavily used for agriculture, especially in Syria. And since it's a semi-arid region and they wanted to irrigate a lot, surface water was not enough. So naturally, people drill wells. And they drilled a lot of wells to the point that they depleted the aquifer. So there was already before the war in 2010, there was a crisis in groundwater. All the springs even dried. And the moment the war started, people started to leave. There was what we call cropland abandonment.
Okay.
So people could not irrigate. They did not have access to their wells. Many of them left and we had a large-scale recovery of groundwater. So when you don't pump and it rains, naturally you would have more water in the ground. And the manifestation of that was that there was springs that dried up in the 1990s re-emerging now. And in my region, this is such a culturally significant event that we even have myths and religious activities revolving around the re-emergence of springs. And here I would like to tell you one of them, which is the story of Adonis and Venus, or in Arabic we call it Ashtarut wa Adonis. So it is a myth that originated in the Mesopotamia, and then it moved to Phoenician lands. And the story goes like that. Adonis was a shepherd, and he was very beautiful. And Venus is the goddess of love, of course.
Of course.
And he was so charming that he made Venus fall in love with him. However, because Venus is so beautiful as well, she has many suitors. And one of them is the god of war, Ares. So Ares was like, you're not gonna have that, I'm gonna kill you. So he pretends to be a boar, a wild boar, and he kills Adonis. And then Venus was so desperate that she went to the underground to try to recover Adonis. When she left the ground, the surface of the land, the love disappeared and everything was so lifeless. Even the plants withered, even the life disappeared from the surface. To the point, even in the Roman version of the story, even Zeus was having fights with his wife. So, and then they were like, Zeus was like, this cannot carry on. We need to find a solution.
Yeah.
So then the solution was that they would allow Adonis to return to the surface. And that's when spring happens. Adonis returns. There's the springs. There's vegetation. There's all the spring season.
Everything is back.
Yeah. And then in winter, Adonis dies and goes to the underground. So in a sense that we carry so much weight about the re-emergence of spring that it's even present in our cultures. Yeah. And the re-emergence of springs in Syria meant that life is back. Adonis is back. So that prompted people to also try to find funding to rehabilitate these springs. And here my supervisor and the team working with him, they realized that this is something that's uncommon, because usually if you have a depleted aquifer, people stay and they're gonna keep pumping.
Yeah.
But in that case, it was very unusual that you have such a regional rebound, regional recovery of groundwater. And this is prompted my PhD. So the first paper was trying to understand the extent of cropland abandonment. How much croplands were abandoned during the conflict. And the other paper was about INSAR, which is using microwave. Here I can expand more if you want.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So for the second paper, we were using this new technique, which is called interferometric synthetic aperture radar. To make it simple.
Yeah, INSAR.
INSAR, exactly. What it does is that it's a satellite that it sends microwaves, and then the microwave returns. And then you measure the time it took from the emission to the reflection. And then, because we know the details of the characteristics of this wave that's been being sent, we can measure how much the surface of the land changed. It went up or it went down.
Uplift or down.
Uplift or subsidence. And in many cases, because there's a lot of groundwater pumping around the world, what happens is that you have subsidence. Major examples involve California, so the Valley, and Mexico City, Jakarta, the Bangladesh, all these coastal cities that are drowning and they are subsiding. Even in Japan, in Tokyo, in the post-war, they had like this economic boom and they started pumping, and there was a lot of subsidence to the point where they were like, this cannot continue, we'll just drown. So they had to stop pumping to stop the subsidence. In our case, it was something else.
Different.
It was the opposite, in fact. There were more water, and instead of the land going down, it was going up.
Yeah, like a belly eating food. So you have the ground uplifting.
And it's like also as I like to say, the breathing of the land.
Yeah.
So the uplift was, we could measure it, and we could really see that this recovery of groundwater is reflected in the surface going up and is reflected by the springs re-emergence.
Amazing.
Yeah. It's a story of really regeneration, and I believe it's an opportunity to better manage water resources, because this is not something that you get, it's not easy to get a reset.
Yeah.
Usually, if you want to drive it by policy, it requires a lot of effort to try to convince people to stop. But here, what we had is that there was the effect of war, and we got kind of a reset.
Yeah.
So now it's our mission to try to prevent the unsustainable practices from coming back.
How was the feeling finding that as result?
It was surprising, in fact, because it wasn't studied elsewhere. So that was a technique that had its focus on subsidence, not on uplift. So the moment I realized that, I could see really the land uplifting, and then I did the analysis to realize that it's uplifting where it's connected to the springs. It was really a moment of eureka for me. And in the PhD, you have very few moments like that. Yeah. And it's usually just trying things, failures, trying this method, trying that. But at some point, I believe that it's those moments that keeps me motivated to do a postdoc.
To continue in research.
To continue in research. It's such a powerful moment when you kind of realize that, I'm up to something here.
Yeah. There is something you built. You call it active framework.
Yeah.
What is it?
Okay. So the ACTI is made out of 4 letters: A, actor; C, context; T, target; I, impact. Actor, context, target, impact. What I'm trying to understand is, how does targeting water infrastructure in conflict zone, who is doing this? Who's the actor? In what context? Is it a civil war, or is it an international armed conflict, or is it a cybersecurity threat? The targets, is it a well? Is it a dam? Is it a water treatment station? Is it an irrigation scheme? And finally, the impact. So is the event leading to water contamination, or is it leading to a loss of accessibility? Is it affecting storage quantities? So mainly, I was interested in that framework because I was looking around, like how many wells were targeted in Ukraine in 2023. Well, I don't know. and it's really hard to try to find in the news, look for such a thing. So what I did was to create a database that filters these events that are related to water, and based on the water conflict chronology. So that's another database, but then I filtered it, and I labeled these 4 dimensions. Mm-hmm. So for each event, we have 1,000 events around. We were able to see the trends, if you want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If today a policymaker in Damascus or Kiev reading your research, actually, what is one of the thing you want them to act on?
Yeah. So in case of Syria, I believe that what we learned from INSOI is that groundwater, it could recover, but it could also go back to the pre-war condition. We have to be very careful not to return to the unsustainable pumping. And there is a very sensitive thing here, is that now there is solar panels. It's such a powerful technology that it grants you infinite power, infinite electricity. And with that, it's up to you to pump until you deplete the aquifer, or you have to restrain through policy how much pumping is allowable. So now it's even more critical in Syria to try to manage groundwater, because before there was the fuel.
Yeah.
You had a limit. You cannot buy fuel infinitely, and the fuel is a commodity, so it can fluctuate in price. And there was also subsidies that that was something that we saw, that when they removed the subsidies on fuel in 2008, before the war, people could not irrigate anymore. They shifted to rain-fed agriculture. So that was something that we also saw, and it also shows that now this limit, this cap, is gone. So it's more critical in Syria to try to irrigate, to manage irrigation. So that's in Syria. In Ukraine, I believe the issue of whether to construct the dam or to keep the ecosystem, the wetlands, is critical. We need to understand, is there enough water to maintain a wetland, or do we need to rebuild the dam to irrigate more, to do hydropower, to do what are the pros and cons of each of one? I hope that I would be able to highlight these questions.
Yeah. Of 5 years doing your PhD, is there any moment you were like, I don't want to continue this PhD?
It wasn't like, I definitely had lows. It was through also the war was a big factor for my lows, let's say. But I always believed that I could carry on. But it's, at some points when everything is blocked, nothing is working, the method is not working, then you definitely feel like you're desperate. But at some point, I always believed that there is a way through. Yeah,
actually, there are several factors, like the fact that you are working with a quite new quite new methodology. And also the fact that you are in your office instead of being in the field. And there are many factors that are quite processing for a researcher like you. So what was the main motivations?
So for me, it was personal, almost. Like it wasn't the degree or the title or the publications. No, it was really trying to understand and put into light and help as much as I can. I cannot be in Lebanon. I have to do it from here. So the best way I found was through my research. So really trying to find this kind of mission, which was personal for me, that was a major motivation. So whenever I felt like, oh, it's not gonna work, and then I would call my dad and then discuss with him the troubles that they were living. Like, no, I have to carry on. I have to keep going, and there's gonna be a result in the end. Now, since I'm done, I'm very pleased that I'm now starting to interact with the Syrians more. So that's through the Swiss Development Cooperation, where there's a new government, there's a new atmosphere in Syria being developed, and I hope that these ideas will be translated to policies.
Yeah. Do you feel yourself proud today after all this long journey?
I can say I'm proud. Yes. Yeah. It was tough. I did my best. I worked hard, and it's satisfying. I have to say.
Was your family also proud of you and also pushing you during your most difficult moments?
Yeah, definitely. My family were a big motivation as well. I mean, I appreciate them a lot, and as I said, they were my connection to reality, to Lebanon, to my region. So whenever I had doubts about the quality of my work, they would remind me that what you're doing is important.
Yeah. So you've titled one of your slides, because I've attended to your public defense. It was touching grass.
Yeah.
What do you mean by touching grass?
Yeah. So if you're working a lot on the PC, there's this Gen Z term that you have to go touch grass, like see what's going on in real life. And touching grass for me was leaving academia and going to Facebook. So on Facebook, what happened is that after my second paper was out, it got viral. And it was viral through Arabiya and
Region.
It's regional newspaper, you know, and a website, I would say. So they took my study and they were like, oh, there's now all this groundwater to sustain all the irrigation projects in Syria. And it was just like an exaggeration, misrepresentation.
Comments, yeah.
Yeah. And then in the comments, there were some very interesting ones. So there were some cynical people like, you don't know anything. What do you mean?
Yeah.
It's there's recovery. Or like there were some people saying, oh, now it's because the political situation changes. That's why the water came back.
Yeah.
And there were some people just making fun that, oh, yeah, for sure. But now we have solar pumps. We're going to pump it back. You know? So that was for me also a moment where I realized that in order to get to to have a real impact, there is a huge base of not academician, and there's the people that I need to target. And I really appreciate your podcast, because in that way people can get to know better geology, science and what we do, and they can know it through stories. And the power of stories and narratives is, I would say, underappreciated in science.
Yeah.
So thanks a lot for what you do.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks. Yeah.
So after all this time, you won the mythic, let's say, competition, Ma Thèse en 180 secondes, in French, actually.
Yeah.
You won it at the scale of the University of Neuchâtel and at the scale of Switzerland. How is the feeling?
Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, for me, it was unexpected completely. And if you look at the YouTube of the first one, complete meltdown.
We put the link.
You put the link, please. And then, so it was unexpected because I was not a French speaker, but I kind of just did pour my heart out, as they say. I was very genuine. And I think that kind of rang a bell to the people. Yeah. This kind of like, I didn't really try to complicate my topic. And I told the story, the story from my perspective for Ukraine and for Syria. And for some reason, here I am. Now every time I say I want the MT on 180 secondes, people start speaking in French. I'm like, maybe a bit, but it took a lot of work, and science communication in that format, the 3-minute format. It's tough, huh?
Is it a difficult exercise?
It's very difficult because you really have to perfect everything in terms of body language, tone, storytelling, the words, what you need to tell, the topics. So it was a very challenging exercise, and I learned tons, really.
And if you have to do it again?
If I have to do it again, I would definitely go for it. But now, in the beginning, I didn't want to do it, but my supervisor kind of
pushed you.
It. And I cannot say I regret it. No, I'm definitely proud of that.
At this point, I want to say congratulations.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, because you finished your PhD. You won this competition.
Yeah.
And now you are a new postdoc.
Exactly.
At EAWAG in Dübendorf, right?
Exactly.
Zurich.
Yeah. So my postdoc, that's what you do after your PhD in academia, is in the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology and Aquatic Science and Technology. And I'm still using remote sensing, but this time in a different field, mining. So
Mining, not water mining.
No, this time mining for resources, for ores, for gold, for copper. But the question of how mining affects water resources is through using remote sensing. So there's conflicts around the world, but it's nowhere close to the scale of mining. And mining, the dilemma with mining is that it's disruptive, so it's changing the environment very harshly, but it's needed.
For resources, anything.
For anything, for our electricity, for our laptops.
Buildings.
Anything, really. So we need to do it. There is no way around it. It's not like petroleum. We can move away from petroleum. It's needed for our technologies, but we need to do it in an environmentally responsible way. So I'm trying to see for the first part of my postdoc, how is it behaving? Like what are the hydrological properties of mines? So it's a very large scale issue. Just to imagine how big is it? The area of lands where there is mining is almost 3 times Switzerland. Yeah.
No way.
Yeah. That's how much there is mines around the world.
Wow.
So it's quite a large area. And if you have a 2-kilometer pit everywhere, and it's taking out dirt, crushing the dirt, throwing that stuff around, that's not good.
Yeah.
So we have to be very responsible in how to do it, but also it's needed.
It's needed. We should find the best way to extract, to manage the earth.
Exactly. The resources, very important.
Are you happy with your topic?
I'm very happy. I'm very happy also with my current team. EAWAG is a great place to work in. I miss Neuchâtel, but I'm also happy to be moving on.
Yeah.
I'll still be around here, hopefully, to teach and to do some, see my friends. But it's really what I wanna do on, carry on. Yeah.
What can we wish you for the future?
What can you wish me? Trying to get my message through. This is something that I really think a lot about, and hopefully through your podcast as well, this will help.
What's your last message for our listeners?
My last message is try to think about how to find hope even in the darkest places. So in Syria, there was all the war, destruction, but the water came back. There was a hope. In Ukraine, the destruction of the dam was, of course, catastrophic, but the re-emergence of wetlands also was a new beginning. I try to always look at the silver lining, so that very thin hope in the darkest of moments. Try to find what's the positive message in the darkest places and keep on going from that place.
Thank you very much, Saeed.
Thanks a lot.